Hey everyone, welcome back to another Microsoft Learn Live session, our second session. So here at Learn Live, we are running a series of courses to enhance your Azure knowledge. Our goal really is to enable you to learn Azure in a way that you can apply it to your own projects. So we are your hosts for this incredible series of classes and courses covering all manner of different Azure services. My name's Kim Philpotts. Over here is my co-host, Glenn Stevens. Glenn, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Cool. Thank you, Kim. Hi, everyone. My name is Glenn Stevens. I'm a senior content developer over here at Microsoft. I've been a software developer for as long as I can remember. I started in my teenage years writing some basic and assembler code on the Commodore computers, and I've just been coding ever since. A long time I've worked in industries like health, finance, education, security, and had most roles that a software developer can have in their lifetime. I love making apps. I love making websites and services, and I still make them to this day. That's probably me in a nutshell. You can always reach out and get in contact with me. You can see my Twitter handle there, Glenn T. Stevens. You can reach out on email at glenn.stevens@microsoft.com. And my GitHub address is Glenn Stevens. That's great. What about you, Kim? Let's give everyone the opportunity to meet you too.
Yeah. Well, before we do that, can I just say I love that picture of you?
Yeah.
It's a funny picture. My picture's not so cool, but this is me. My name's Kim Philpotts. I'm also a senior content developer at Microsoft. I too have been coding probably for longer than I can remember, starting out in Apple II, and sort of from there on. Did a lot of work, a lot of consulting, ended up doing a lot of mobile development. Some of you may be familiar with Glenn and I from Xamarin University, but now everything's about the cloud. And so I spend my time there. I'm based in Melbourne, Australia. Glenn, you're also in Australia as well, but you know, being Australia, we're a long distance apart. And over here, you can see my details. If you want to reach out to me, ask any questions via Twitter or email, or have a look at my GitHub repos, please feel free to do so. Okay, so that's sort of a little bit about me. Let's talk about our session today. And in fact, I've got this this slide here. And today's session is all about databases. So what we want to do, being our second session, we've already talked about this scenario before, but let's go back to it, because for those of you who are new here, you might be wondering what a Van Arsdale is. And of course, for all the details, go back and have a look at the previous recorded session, which you can find on the Learn website. But really the scenario we have is we're talking about a fictitious company called Van Arsdale. It's in the real estate business. It runs a lovely little website where they sell real estate. So the project itself is built in .NET Core. It uses SQL Server as its database. It's pretty much a common sort of combination for a lot of applications. You know, you've got a website, you've got a SQL Server database as well. So the idea here is, you know, originally all of this stuff was hosted on premises, but Van Arsdale wants to move to the cloud. They are planning on a lot of future growth. Specifically what they want to do is they want to migrate everything into Azure, basically. So that's it in a nutshell. I've just gone through one slide too far there. That's, you know, kind of what the sessions or what the scenario is all about. Van Arsdale moving to the cloud. In the previous session, we basically went and had a look at the website. So, you know, how to get that up into the cloud. We went and we used an app service in order to bring it up to the cloud. And again, you know, if you missed the session, go back and have a look at it. It's all recorded. But now for today's session, Glenn, what are we going to do in today's session? Can you give me a quick overview?
Yeah, great question, Kim. So we're going to get our project one step closer towards completing that migration just by giving it a cloud-based database. And the choice of the database solution is going to really dictate how we're going to migrate the data. So this means we've got two core objectives today. We want to select the appropriate database solution for our Van Arsdale real estate project, and then we'd also want to do the migration from the on-premises data into the cloud.
There we are. I was a little bit late on the slides there, but yeah, there are our two objectives there. Okay, cool. So you're going to be my database expert for today. And together we're going to try and get this right. Of course, if there's any questions that people have, or comments as we go through, or you just want to introduce yourself, tell us perhaps where you live or something about where you live, feel free to use the chat window. In case you haven't noticed it there, we've got the chat window. We've also got some people moderating that as well to answer your questions. But let's go back to our Van Arsdale current state of the project. So really what we have is we've got this we have this on-premise installation. We want to move everything up into the cloud. We've already taken care of the website, and now it's about finding a way of moving that database here as well. So we're trying to find a solution that really works best for this particular application. And we're going to walk through some scenarios and some different options, and we're going to find an optimal solution, hopefully, for our project. But I suppose the first thing to ask, Glenn, when we find this solution, is it going to be the right solution for every possible scenario?
No, it's certainly not. It always is going to depend on what the current situation and your current technology stack is. I'm a big fan of there's a statement we used to talk about in one of our classes at Xamarin University, which was there's no best practice, there's only good practice in context. I think that fits everywhere in situations like this. There's just too many variables to have one solution that's going to fit all use cases, and it's going to depend on the people and the team. Management might be careful about spending, and that might be spending on infrastructure or spending on doing rework in order to move things over. You might the admins may not want to give up servers, and then there's also the development story. How familiar are the developers with the technology they use, and they're about to select? Are there time constraints? What expertise already exists? And if you're working on any migration, you've probably been discussing or having these discussions between management, developers, and admin all over at Van Arsdale anyway.
Yeah, it's a complex thing. So what I'm kind of hearing from you, and if I can paraphrase this with a meme, is there's no simple answer to how do I migrate my data to the cloud. It's something that's going to have to be decided on a case-by-case basis. But what we have is we've picked a scenario which is fairly common, right? And, if you go and you create yourself a new .NET Core project from scratch, this is what you get. You get a local SQL database. And that's pretty much what today's session's built around. But it's not only about the technologies used, but also about the people involved. So, in general, as it says here on the meme, one does not simply migrate a database. But, for scenarios like ours, we've got some pretty good news. Hopefully by the end of today's session, we'll know how to select the best database solution for a project like this. So our Van Arsdale real estate one. And like I said, that's very similar to a lot of other ones. So we'll have created a relational database on Azure, and we'll have transferred the data from our on-premises SQL Server into the cloud. Okay, so that's sort of where we are now. We have some resources for the session here, so let's talk about these, Glenn. First of all, our learner requirements. Can you cover that one off for me? What are we expecting of the learner today?
Yeah, I think probably at its core, we expect that you would have worked with a SQL database. And ideally, it's going to be SQL Server, maybe a local database. But if you've worked with other databases like maybe MySQL or Postgres, you'll probably be fine with what we're looking at today. You will need access to an Azure subscription. You also need to know how to navigate and use the Azure portal. And you would have deployed the starter solution from our first class in the series.
Yeah, or you could have continued to use the one if you're still there. Absolutely.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah,
and there's a bunch of tools that we'll use as well. So you'll need access to Visual Studio 2019, right? You can probably use Visual Studio Code if that's suitable too. There's the Azure portal, which you'll be using. You would have been familiar with that from the last session. The Data Migration Assistant, which is a fantastic tool, and also the Azure Data Studio.
Yeah, so a few tools that maybe some people use. They might be new to other people as well.
Yeah, and the last tool was actually probably this is the ARM template. So if you're coming in cold, maybe this is the first time you've taken a Learn Live class. We've got some ARM templates where you can just set up your infrastructure and be exactly the starting point for today's session. So we'll pop that link on the screen.
Sure, we will. In fact, let me let me go ahead and bring that up.
We'll do that in post.
No. We'll do it now. We'll do it now as soon as I find my my Microsoft Edge.
That's all right. While you're doing that, cool. So a word of caution here. Unlike other resources on Azure, there's no completely free tier for the databases that we're looking at today. So you can spend a lot of money per month on databases. We're going to get back to this later, but it can't hurt to bring it up, this topic now. If you're planning to follow along with what we're doing today, you might want to have the starter solution deployed to Azure. You might want to be in the state like we had it at the end of session 1.
I actually just did this, Glenn. So can I actually just show you?
Please.
Yeah, exactly what you need to do. So here we are over on our GitHub repo that we mentioned. This is where all the source code sits. But if you come down here, there's a couple of buttons, deploy to Azure. So this is sort of at the end of session 1. There's also the option 2 here, create a web application referencing the code from GitHub. So it'll basically pull the code up for you. If you go ahead and you press that button, then it's actually going to come through here and it's going to allow you to deploy. It's going to ask you a few questions. In fact, there we are. And so you can set your subscription. You can talk about resource groups. You can create a new resource group for it. Set its location and the app service name. So these are all things that we kind of configured last time, but you can basically use this to get it running. So that's sort of, once you deploy that, it should be up. And here's an example of the one that I just deployed into the Azure portal. But let's have a look at the deployed website first of all. Hey? So it's, in my case, it's right here. Learn live. Learn real estate Van Arsdale dev.uwebsites.net. And this is basically deployed to my private Azure subscription. And it doesn't show anything too interesting, right? In fact, we can see this orange banner here. It's basically using mock data, okay, or a sample data repository. And the reason for that is we migrated the website, but we haven't actually connected up the database to it as yet. Okay, so like I said, you can go and you can deploy it directly from GitHub via the ARM template. You can also deploy it from Visual Studio as well. Okay, so basically, as long as you do that, you get the website up, and you'll see that it's running, but it's not connecting to a database. So what we're hoping to do today then is we'll know how to pick the most appropriate database solution for our project, hook that database up to our website, and then we'll find a way of moving our data from our local SQL Server installation into the cloud. Okay, so let's duck back over to the slides here for a second, and I'll switch scenes here. So Glenn, you already mentioned that there are going to be different team members involved in the process, right? And they all have different expectations around cloud migration. So what is it that they're looking for, I suppose?
I think as a developer, ideally, if you can achieve the same thing with less effort, which probably means without code changes from migration, that's going to be the ideal. And so no code changes, which sounds pretty good to be true, but it's actually going to happen in today's session. So another topic is maintenance. Kim, do you want to field the maintenance aspect?
Yeah, so this whole idea of no code changes sounds pretty cool, but also we have maintenance, right? So this is something that administrators will need to worry about. I don't know if I'm assuming, Glenn, I know you've been around in the industry for a long time. You remember those situations where you're jammed into a server closet, right? And you're sitting there with this tiny little screen, installing patches and things like that.
Yeah.
Well, obviously one of the things that we don't want to be doing is that anymore. So we want to make sure that things actually are maintainable as well, and we have low maintenance.
Yeah, so, you just triggered my flashback memory to a 2 a.m. wake up call.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to trigger you.
No, that's probably the wrong term to use. Let's edit that out of this recording.
Okay, let's do that. What about this next one, Glenn? Let me advance the slide here.
Scalability. Oh, I love scalability. So imagine with just a flick of the switch, we can get more throughput on our server and have more power instead of buying entirely new hardware and configuring all of that.
Oh,
So it's not only about scaling up, but it's also about scaling down if you need to. Maybe you've got some peak period times. Maybe you've got the Christmas time period and you're operating a retail shop, and then all of a sudden your sales spike. But in January, February, things slow down. You want to scale your servers down as well. That's really hard to do with on-premises hardware, but easy to do in the cloud.
yeah, it's super important, that whole discussion about being able to scale down as well, so you don't have to provision for the worst case scenario. Yeah, but this whole idea of scaling is pretty much one of the big expectations about moving to the cloud, right? It's really one of the killer arguments that people have. Why do we want to move to the cloud? So we can scale properly. What about this one? We've got a lot of cloud power at our hands and potentially a lot of traffic hitting our resources. And with great power comes great responsibility. So of course, security is important as well. That's a very important one. And probably the last point here as well. This sort of kind of wraps it up. If we already know the stuff, it's good for us because it flattens the learning curve, right? So basically we want to stick with a drop-in replacement if we can for our SQL database, instead of perhaps going to like a NoSQL DB, like Cosmos DB or something like that. We might just want to take what we already know, move that into the cloud. Because, it would require some pretty heavy refactoring of our application to and get the development team to spend a lot of time to learn about new technologies. So sometimes it's good to work with what you already know. So then what do you think? Is it a good strategy to stick with a relational database?
Is it a good strategy? Well, I think in our case, we're doing a real estate website. So if I was doing...
Let me bring that up, yeah.
Yeah, if I was doing something like that, then I would go, well, what are the things I'm going to need? Well, I'll need a database that has good searching criteria, because people always want to search for what they want, and also good location support. And the databases, in my mind, that support it really well in the cloud are Azure SQL Server and also Azure Cosmos DB. And from the migration point of view, Azure SQL Server is going to be the easiest path out of that. So yeah, I would stick with actually, you asked about a relational database. But yeah, a relational database matches the format and the shape of the data we have. It's pretty well known what data we need. And a relational database is good from that point of view. And we can certainly store all the columns and information we have. We could potentially get data feeds from other services later, and we know which structure to move things into. It's a really adaptive approach. So...
yeah, and it kind of just suits what we have here, where we've got this sort of,
yeah,
property, and we've got some details about those properties as well.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I guess what you're saying is it depends on the project. When people are new to a certain technology, they often ask, what's the best approach? What's the best practices? And as we mentioned, it depends, right? What is it that you're trying to achieve? And can you afford to just throw everything away and start again?
Is it going to serve my needs? That's really important.
It's super important. So in our case, what we want to do is we want to query individual properties. We want to filter and search through our properties. So if I come back here, we've got our application here. Okay. So we've got, some pretty structured data, and there's no benefit in having dynamic document-based database. But from a new project, it might be a different story. Okay, so let's talk about what Azure has to offer in regards to like SQL Server compatible relational databases. So I've got some slides here, and we picked basically 4 database options. But I guess there's other alternatives as well, right? So what do you think there, Glenn?
What do I think there? I mean, from a database perspective, there's Postgres, MySQL. I mean, you could use table storage. You could use Cosmos DB. You could use Oracle, even IBM DB2. There's lots of those options. If you hit that create a resource button and you type in any database, that chances are you'll actually probably find the most common ones there. Um, but it'll give you relational data structures, but the implementation is actually different for those other databases. And that means the code would possibly need to be changed. And also keep in mind our expectations. We don't want that much change, but instead we want to leverage what we already know, and that reduces the available options really to the Azure SQL databases that you can see on the screen.
Yeah, yeah. Let's start with what we know, and in fact, let's start with the last one here, because it's a little bit special. So basically, if you had a virtual machine with SQL Server installed, wouldn't that be optimal for us, because it actually maps exactly to what we have in our on-prem scenario?
Mm. You know what? It sounds tempting. It sounds kind of true, but you've actually reduced the amount of maintenance by doing that. Or have you really?
You haven't.
We would be responsible for the operating system installation updates, SQL Server patches, and the only change is really, instead of working with your machine on premises, you just have remote connection to the server. There's still a lot of pain points that exist with that configuration.
Yeah. So instead of looking at my 14-inch CRT screen, I can put the browser on my ultra wide, and it'll be much, much easier.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So we haven't really solved all of our problems there, or at least we're not getting all the benefits of perhaps moving to the cloud. So let's have a look at the others. So we got a single database here at the top. What's that about?
Well, a single database is very equivalent to an isolated local database. So think of it like database as a service. It's a database that's mostly isolated from the server instance and other databases on the server.
So
that's probably the...
Yeah, so you just mentioned there's a server involved. Is this database running on SQL Server? Do you have to maintain that server?
You have to maintain that server? No, because it's a platform as a service offering. I think that's what the question you're asking there, Kim.
Yeah.
Well, it's actually on a resource that allows you to... The server is really grouping databases. One server can have multiple databases, like in a local SQL Server installation, but it's not a server in the traditional sense, where you have to worry about installing patches and, like we were talking about with the VMs, or do any maintenance work. It's what gets exposed by the cloud so we can connect to it. The same way you'd connect to a database using SQL Server Management Studio if you're working on an on-premise situation.
Yeah, cool. So we'll have a bit of a look at the server part in a bit when we go and create the database in the portal. But back to the single database, what does it offer feature-wise?
Oh, it's got a few nice things. It comes with built-in backups, no downtime while scaling up or down, which is pretty important.
That's pretty magical.
Yeah, we've also got some downsides too. It doesn't support all the SQL Server features, like, for example, writing stored procedures using .NET.
Okay, but if we're not using those, we should be fine.
Yeah. There's essentially, I think most developers are often working with just SQL and Transact SQL. For those they should be fine. But there's also a document showing all the limitations of Azure SQL Server. And in terms of scaling, I think we've got that link. We'll just pop it on the screen.
Yeah, I'll just throw it on the screen. Hang on, and I'll just paste it into the chat window for everyone as well.
Cool. So in terms of scaling, what we need to keep in mind is that it's manual. If I need more throughput, then I'll actually flick a switch and it will scale.
Okay. So that sounds pretty promising. I'm just looking at this document as well. So it's got all of the SQL features and what's supported on each platform. So, as we mentioned, you definitely want to, not every migration is going to be the same. So you'll definitely want to have a look through documents like this to work out your scenario. Okay. But anyway, that sounds all pretty promising. Let's have a look at the others though. So the next one, the elastic pool option. So that's similar to the single database, but it allows us to share resources across databases. And actually we'll see later that elastic pool is an option when setting up a single database and not a separate resource. So it's useful if you have multiple databases that aren't self-contained, right? And you can't predict the amount of resources each one needs, and maybe the required resources fluctuate quite a bit as well. And really that brings us to our last real option. And we've already eliminated the virtual machine with SQL Server, but we have the managed instance. So that is the most compatible option when comparing to a local SQL Server installation. It's more powerful, but it's also more expensive. So, Glenn, how should we decide what the best option for us is?
Okay, so for us, the decision criteria would be the number of active databases and also the simplicity of the migration. And if we apply that to our options, there's really probably only one choice that makes sense. And we'll actually put that question out there to the audience. What do you think it's going to be?
Wait for a few responses. I can tell you what I think.
Yeah, what do you think, Kim?
Well, look, I don't think we need the extra features that a managed instance offers. We've only got one database in our project, and I think that that means that a single database gives us exactly what we want. Okay, so it delivers very predictable performance at multiple service levels with pretty much zero administration. So we can connect to it just like we do with an existing SQL Server database using the same tools. It's got a couple of neat features as well. So what's some features? Let's have a look here. Scales. It's fully managed. They're all very, very useful things. Okay, anything you want to add, Glenn?
Yeah, I'm actually okay there. I think there's well, actually we talked about the features and advantages of our choice. But we'll also be able to connect to this database from our local tools. Before I mentioned SQL Server Management Studio, and you can actually use that to connect into your tooling. You could use Visual Studio to connect in. You could use the Azure Data Explorer, which is another great tool, which is a cross-platform one. But we can keep using the local database or change the connection string to point to the new database instance in Azure that we're about to create. So it's actually not that different from connecting to a database hosted on a local SQL Server installation. And that means we can use whatever database editing or querying tool that we prefer. And there's also lots of other tools that we're already using with our local instance that are likely to work with Azure SQL Server too.
Yeah, so that's good news, right? It calls back to what we talked about earlier on about using the tools that you're already familiar with, which is really awesome. Okay, how are we going for time, Glenn? We good to continue?
It's 2:25. There's probably about 5 minutes. This section's a 20-minute section, so I think we might just stop here for a little bit of a break.
Okay, well let's have a break, and we'll see you after the break. Hey, welcome back, Glenn.
Oh, thanks, Kim. Great to be back. Great to be chatting with you again.
Yeah. Okay, where we're up to, we're going to talk about creating a SQL database in Azure.
Absolutely.
Yep. Yeah. So probably the first thing, the most important thing to understand is it's really no different connecting to a local server, using a host name or using a URL or an IP address, to get to our Azure-based database. So what we'll do is we'll swap over to a full screen here into the portal. So I'm logged into the portal, and we'll go ahead and create ourselves a resource. Okay, so as I go through, Glenn, if you see me do anything wrong, just let me know.
You got it.
Beautiful. So I'm going to hit create resource here. And what I'm looking for is just a single SQL database. So, I could come in here and I could type SQL database in here and find a SQL database. I could come to the databases section here and have a look at the databases as well. But basically we want to select a single database. Okay, and so now we come to our blade where we're going to create or set up the different options for creating this database. Make sure our subscription is right. We're going to want to put this under a resource group. I think we're probably best to use the one that we set up earlier.
That would make a lot of sense. Remember, the resource group is the consolidation of Azure services that we want for our final solution.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, and then what we need to do is we need to pick a name for our database. And the names for our databases and the name for our objects, we mentioned this in the previous session. We should follow some guidelines on this. So again, what we have is we've got a page here. I'll paste that into the chat window about the recommended naming and tagging conventions. And if we do a little bit of a search here and we say SQL, if I could spell SQL, okay, we can see that, for example, it's recommended we use SQL DB dash as our prefix. So we should follow some guidelines. So let's call this database name. And importantly, this doesn't have to be globally unique, right? It only needs to be unique within the server. Yep. And so, that actually brings us back to, this idea of a server that we mentioned earlier on. When you actually go and create your first Azure SQL database, you actually also create an Azure SQL logical server, which you can think of as your admin container for your databases. So that's where you're going to control your logins and your firewall rules, the security policies through that logical server. And you can actually, go and override that for each of the different databases within the logical server as well, which kind of makes sense. And so we can, add more databases to that logical server. So the server name here, the database name, let's start that off with, let's not put that in there. What do we want to call this thing? Let's call it, what do we say? SQL DB. Oh, hang on. SQL DB. Yep. What do you think? Van Arsdale? Or no, real estate. We'll call it SQL DB / real estate. And then we have a server. So we can select a server here if we have one. Now we don't have one at the moment, so we want to go ahead and we want to create a new one. So this is where we're going to put in the server name. And this does have to be globally unique. Yeah. So the name that we enter here becomes part of the URL. We can see that there, .databases.windows.net. So let's call this something like DB server Van Arsdale KP1. Let's see if that's available. That looks good. We need to give it an admin login as well. So what's our username and password? If I try and put in admin in here, there's a bunch of keywords which you probably don't want to use.
Things like root or admin, or there's probably some others there too, right?
Yeah. So I'm going to use Van Arsdale DB admin, and I'm going to throw a password in here as well. And there's, a whole bunch of different password restrictions as well. So it enforces strong passwords. Makes a lot of sense. And then we set the location for it. That location, we want to pick a location which is ideally geographically close to where we created our other resources or what's going to connect to it.
Which was central US for us, right?
That's
right.
The
one we selected in the last.
Yep.
So
even though we're in Australia, we probably want to create that database close to where it's actually being used. So we'll say central US. Smash the OK button. Okay, so it says, hey, I'm going to create a new SQL server for you. So now that we have that, we've got all the credentials we need, but there's some other configuration options here as well. So there's this compute and storage. So what are those all about, Glenn?
Yeah, we probably just need to park the screen and look at them. There's three things that are used to define the performance of our database. There's the CPU, memory, and disk space, or bandwidth, or throughput as well. And a certain combination is going to result in a certain price. So if I ran through a scenario, and might be just making up some numbers here, but if we had a configuration where we had 4 CPUs or 4 cores, 32 gig of RAM and 10 gig of storage, and the Azure portal will give us an estimation about the monthly cost for that. And Azure's not really running on floppy disk drives. We're far more advanced than that. There's SSDs and other good options for us, but
all the millennials know what that means, right?
They do.
So does that mean I have to decide up front what kind of configuration I need? So, how would I know how many floppy disks or how many CPUs to throw at this thing? What if I pick the wrong configuration? What if I've allocated too many resources and I find out I'm only actually using a small percentage of them? What do I do about that?
Well, it's a good question. And remember, this is a platform as a service offering. There's also the term DB as a service too.
DBAS.
You can DBAS. Yeah, always mentally in my head, it's like DBAS is like the base, always dropping it. It's but yeah, it's you can always change the configuration. You can scale up, or you can pay more, and you can also scale down and pay less if you notice you allocated too many resources. So it's very similar to hardware. Like it almost, but if you think about the benefits of the cloud, it's really difficult with physical hardware to dynamically remove CPUs or RAM from an
Yeah.
existing machine. But with the cloud configuration, the hardware has already been paid for. We can just scale up and scale down as we need to.
Cool. Cool. So we should switch back to the portal and have a look at what options we have there. Let me just come back over here. So what have we got here at the moment? We've got Gen 5 2V core. If I say configure database, have a look at what these options are.
So what have we got right now?
Okay, so we have our compute tier. Okay, we've got serverless options. There's a whole bunch of different settings in here, but here we have provisioned. We've got Gen 5 up to 80 V cores, and in fact, we can set the number of V cores, which configures the number of CPUs essentially. So a V core is like an abstraction, right? And as a rule of thumb, you can roughly map one V core to one physical CPU core. So if you've got a 6-core CPU in your current on-premises installation, you'd probably pick 6 V cores to match that performance. And you don't have to worry about memory. Every V core comes with a pre-configured amount of memory. And that's why you can't set it separately. But you can set the amount of disk space your data needs. So, when creating a database, our main focus is on, how many V cores do I need, or how much disk space should I allocate?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, the concept of vCores, it makes it easy to configure exactly what you need. And like you said, we could always change those settings as we go without downtime. You might need a little bit more, you might need a little bit less. But there's more settings here on this page too. If we look at the Gen 4 and the Gen 5 tabs at the top, we can,
Or down here?
or at the button, sorry, at the bottom, we can see that out. And that defines the hardware generation that we're running on. And by picking on an older generation, we can actually save a little bit of money, but the configuration may not be as fast enough for our needs. So I guess it's like using some of the processors, like it might be, goodness, I'm drawing a blank here. It might be the difference between the PlayStation 3 and the PlayStation 4. Oh, Xbox, I should have mentioned Xbox. The Xbox One.
The Xbox One and the Xbox One X.
One X. Like there's essentially, it's running the same thing, but you get a bigger power boost as a result of that.
Yeah.
Yep. Mental note there, don't improv and use PlayStation. Use Xbox. All right. Good. But I mean, there's other options we've got here too, like hyperscale or the business critical. And if you need super low latency, you might want to check those out. So I don't think we need like the extreme low levels for our project, but if you're running in a business where that's applicable, you might want to do your own investigation.
Yeah. So this vCore based approach is the recommended way of configuring a database these days. And Glenn, you mentioned, for some special cases, you might want to look at the business critical option and consider Gen 5. Pretty much the concepts are the same. We're just talking about, more powerful machines. There is one setting here that we didn't talk about, and this is provisioned versus serverless. So if you think back to our last episode where we talked about app service plans, we mentioned the serverless Azure functions, or functions as a service, the serverless sort of options. When you're using those, you only pay for the actual execution time, and that's what serverless is all about. It doesn't mean you don't have a server, it just means you pay as you go, and only for as long as you're actually using the resource. So in contrast to this, provision means you know up front how much you're going to pay per month, but you're going to pay it even if you're not using the resource. But the serverless option sort of gives us a little bit more flexibility with regard to configuration options. So, if we go and have a look here, we can automatically increase or decrease the number of vCores depending on the incoming traffic. And if I switch to the serverless here, you can see that we have our estimation over here. So we can see that we perhaps have a value here. If we switch over to serverless, this is sort of how much we're paying as it goes through. Excuse me. So now that we know these options, we want to think about our best options, and how do we actually go and make that decision? And pretty much our requirements are defined by the current on-premises SQL Server installed hardware configuration. And what our job is in Van Arstor is to achieve at least the same performance as a local SQL Server installation. And of course, the cool thing is that we have the option to scale it further. But we have to think about costs as well. So what do you think, Glenn? What and people in the chat, feel free to pop in your suggestions. What would be a good choice for our scenario, you think?
Well, I think if you've already got a website up and running with a database, especially if you've been running in a data center for a while, you really kind of know what to expect traffic-wise. And in those cases, provision seems to be the best option for me. So serverless would be cheaper if there's no traffic, but if you've got a constant amount of traffic, that service would be more expensive. So going with provision is actually what we should do. And with the provision selection, this translates to the number of vCores. The amount of data is known because of your on-premises installation. Hopefully you've been monitoring some of that data coming through too, and you get a predictable monthly cost known up front. And you can start with just one vCore during development and then add more cores as you scale up. And in fact, you can scale up or down at any time.
Yeah, cool. So
it's kind of an interesting challenge.
Yeah. But it means that we've sort of talked about the best option for our requirements. And, for the sake of an example, we could go with like a Provision Gen 4, and we could do like 10 cores, and, we can up this. But, we start seeing some bigger prices up here as well. Now, there's another option as well, and that is something called a DTU. And we find it under the tab to the far left, okay, under this looking for here. So we have the number of DTUs. So what's that all about?
So a DTU is, it's often referred to as a data transfer unit. And it was really the only option when database as a service started, but it's kind of harder to understand what a DTU is. A vCore actually makes more sense because it's got a very similar analogy to a core in a computer.
Yeah.
But a DTU is an abstraction of the amount of CPU and memory and throughput combined together. So depending on the hardware that's used in a certain number of DTU maps to the CPU core with a certain amount of RAM. So it's kind of a relative abstraction because it changes depending on the hardware generation you select. So it's kind of hard to grasp, but it's probably why the recommended thing these days is the vCore. But there's some benefit to the DTU. You can get a really cheap database option. Right. So if you pull that slider all the way to the left, Kim, then you'll see how low the price will be, but it'll still be powerful enough for our exercise here.
Yeah.
So what have we got on there?
$5 a month.
Yeah, it's pretty good.
You could get a database on Fiverr for that.
Yeah.
So that's that's really that's a really good tip. If you need to spin up a server, and perhaps you're just doing it for development or for just testing out, and you're not going to have much load on it. This is a really cheap way of spinning one up. Okay. Now, are we going to go with this for our sample at the moment? I think we are. Okay. So let's go ahead and apply that. Okay. So here we are. We've got basic. We've got 100 mega storage. We don't have a lot of data. So let's go ahead and create that database. We can see our estimated cost up here. We can see our various options. Let's go ahead and hit the create button. So this is going to take a little bit of time while it's sort of spinning up some resources up here, submitting that template here. While we're waiting for that, maybe we can have a bit of a look at Visual Studio or our goal is to eventually connect to this database, either with, Visual Studio or, some other tool, query some data. Got any tools that you like to use, Glenn?
Yeah, actually, I really like the Azure Data Studio, because I do mobile development as well. Sometimes I'm on Windows, sometimes I'm on the Mac, and Data Studio is available on those. And regardless of which operating system I'm using, I've got some good tools that will connect to an Azure database.
Yeah. So let's have a look here. Azure Data Studio. Okay. So here we are. We have the install for Azure Data Studio. I've actually got this installed on my machine.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah. Let me just spin this up and drag it up to the window up here. It's an Electron app, which is why it's doing that. But here we are. Hey, this looks familiar. Why does this look familiar?
It looks a lot like Visual Studio Code, don't you think?
It does. It does. Okay. So what do we want to do here? We want to go and we want to create a new connection. Okay. So should we do this through here?
We should.
Okay. So I'm going to create a new connection. So a connection type, SQL Server. We need to know about the server name in order to put it in here.
Yeah, we probably should go back to the portal once that database is created. See the URL.
Okay, cool. You cut out there for a second, but I think what you were saying is we should be able to come in here and we should be able to see the URL.
Yeah, I think the deployment's still happening though. You may want to check the notification bar.
It is still happening.
Yeah, so we might have a little bit of on a hold music while we wait.
Fantastic. But we do have the server name here already.
Oh, we do? That's true.
Yeah, so I reckon we could probably just copy that and we could come back into Azure Data Studio. We could put that in. And then we're going to need some credentials, right?
Yeah, we should.
Okay. So what we want to do is we want to find those credentials that I entered earlier on, which I copied and pasted. All right. Now we may have a trouble here. Let's have a look. Let's see. Ooh. So this is interesting. And there's an error. So what's going on here, Glenn?
Let's have a look. Oh, okay. So this is actually one of the common security issues when we're working with Azure SQL Server. What's happened is that your client IP address doesn't have access to the server. It's about security. One of the requirements that we talked about is that even though the server has a public IP address, it won't allow external connections. It'll allow connections from within Azure, but not outside. So in the portal, we need to find a link to configure the firewall settings, or we can let Azure Data Tool make the changes on our behalf if we log in with our Azure account. So it's probably a good idea to switch to the portal.
Yeah, I've switched back there.
Yep, and in the toolbar at the top, if my memory serves me correctly.
Where are we looking? We're looking for
the database and
firewalls, perhaps.
You try the firewalls.
That's not the one.
Add client IP. Yeah, you're in there already. So where it's got the rule name, you can essentially hit the rule name. If you add the client IP, I think it'll extract your local IP address from your machine.
Yeah, fantastic.
And set up the rule. And that's a nice, convenient one.
What about this option here? So there's a nice little button here which says allow Azure services and resources to access this server. So that's probably something we want to put in here as well. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's all depending on the configuration. We've got that turned off. It's one of those things that when you create the SQL Server, other services within Azure can connect to it if they know the details. And if you want to lock that out, you could turn that off, etc.
So, but my personal opinion is that you'd switch this to be on, right, which allows some of the tools in Azure to go and access the database. So like there's a database explorer that's built into the portal.
Yeah.
So we'll turn that on. We've added our client IP address, which is great because I've doxed my static IP. And what we want to do is we want to make sure we hit the save button here. Okay, so go ahead and we save that. It's going to update the firewall rules. So that's been updated. Let's go back to our system here and see if we can now connect to it. Hey, look at that. Down the bottom here. In fact, I may be able to zoom in here. We see that we've got a database.
Yeah, that's exactly what we wanted. Good.
Okay. Do we need anything from the server group? I don't think we do. I think we could probably just hit connect there, couldn't we?
Yeah, we should get the details expand out.
All right. And so now we're actually connected to that database. So it doesn't really make any sense to continue here as long as we don't have any more data. So we're going to get a database in the cloud, but just for reference, we could do exactly the same thing from Visual Studio as well. If we wanted to come in here and we say, which one would you go for? SQL Server, Object Explorer?
There's that one. I mean, you can also use SQL Server Management Studio as well. That's pretty cool.
Just pause there again, Glenn.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was saying that you could use SQL Server Management Studio, which has been around for a long time.
Right. Yeah.
Which comes with SQL Server.
Yeah. Yeah. But we could certainly come in here and we could probably do it from here actually. And we can go and have a look at our network database from here. Okay.
Yeah.
So all of the same things, we could connect to that same database. So that's really cool, right? Because it means that we can go ahead and use any of the tools that we're familiar with. Okay. So let's talk about, back to our journey. Database is up in the cloud. It's still sitting there as empty. What are our options to get our local database from a on-premises install up in the cloud? And there's probably two options, right?
Yeah, probably two major ones. In the terms of migrating our data, we can either use the Azure Data Migration Service or we can use the Data Migration Assistance app, which we talked about a little bit earlier. And if you don't mind switching over to the slides, Kim.
Yeah, sure.
The Data Migration Server can communicate to the local database over a virtual network. And this service sits in the cloud, and we're able to set up a virtual network to connect from the cloud onto the on-premises instance of our SQL Server, so we can have a reasonably seamless communication between on-premises and the cloud. And this service is really great for large-scale database migrations across a virtual network.
Yeah, we probably don't have a large-scale setup though.
No, it's not that complicated. No.
Yeah, so we've got a small project, so something that's nice and easy. Perhaps this has got a few more features than we really need to, and probably has a little bit more setup. So what's the alternative to this one?
Now, for our single database, the Data Migration Assistant will work just as well. It gets installed locally and then pushes data up into the cloud. So it's cool. a lot simpler than the other options.
Fantastic. Cool. So it's basically just pushing the data up.
Yeah, it's creating the structures or the equivalent structures on your Azure SQL Server and then copying the data from the source to the destination.
Yeah, cool. So if you have already downloaded for people watching, if you've already downloaded it, we can spin up the Data Migration Assistant. I'll do it here.
Oh, awesome.
And again, I'm just spinning it up. It's just popping up on my other screen. Let me put it up here so you can have a look at it. So, it's a nice, simple tool. It's project based. So what we can do is we can create a new migration project. So I can either do an assessment if we don't know yet if, you know, what we're trying to do is 100% compatible, we can just run an assessment. It will give us a report on that. So we're going to skip over that because we know our environment is pretty simple. So we'll say migration. We'll give this a project name. So let's call this Van Arsdale. Our SQL Server type. Okay, so this is where our database, or where our data is coming from, right? In our case, it's a local database. Okay, so we can say, hey, it's a SQL Server. And we're saying, hey, where does this go to? Where are we going to? So we're going to an Azure SQL database, a managed instance, another SQL Server. So this is actually a pretty useful tool for just migrating data. So we can also say, hey, what do we want to migrate? Just the schema, just the data, or the schema and the data? And we don't have anything at the moment, so I think schema and data is what we're after. Let's hit create. And first of all, we're specifying our source. Let me see if I can make this all a little bit bigger up here. Okay, so our source of our data is our local DB. Okay, cool. So it's MS SQL local DB. I could authenticate to this, you know, using SQL authentication. I'll just have this as Windows authentication. Okay, let's try connect to that. Okay, and it's connected. And what it's done is it's brought up a whole list of databases that I have on my local environment. The one that I want is this one here. Okay. Interestingly, actually, oops, if you did want to know where you can find that out in the Van Arsdale project, or, you know, in our case, we've got our development settings in our development settings.json. We can see that it's got the database name here. So that was something that was created by Entity Framework, that ID. So that one there that ends in BAD. Beautiful. Let's go ahead and hit the next button.
Cool. And now we're just selecting the destination service, right?
That's right. So
this seems really easy, Kim.
Yeah, this is super easy. Let me get that server name. I'm not sure whether, was that the one? I'm not sure that's the one that we had. Let's just go back to the portal for a second.
The portal is the source of truth. Let's find out the database and server name.
Absolutely.
But our overview, this is the server itself.
Is that what we're after? We're after this. Yeah,
we're after the server name. Yep. So that's the one you just want to copy that to the clipboard.
In this case, I'm going to use SQL Server authentication and then throw back in my username and my password. Okay. Hit the connect button. Okay, and there's our database. Beautiful.
Voila.
Voila. Awesome. Let's hit next. Okay, let's wait for it. So it's basically going to have a look at all the objects in the database now, and it's going to say, "Hey, what things do you want to actually move across?"
Now we can see those chevrons at the top of the screen going from left to right about where we are in the process. So we get a sense of what's going to happen too.
We're halfway. Okay.
We're halfway there.
And here we are. We have all of our various objects in here. So they're all selected by default.
Excellent.
Let's go with that. And so we can now generate a SQL script. And not surprisingly, this is actually just generating a script to migrate our data.
Awesome.
So if we want, we could, you know, copy that out and we could store it away somewhere if we want, or in my case, I'm just going to deploy that schema. Lots of green ticks. That's a good sign.
Cool.
So, you know, this is no different to actually just connecting to the database and running it. So if you didn't want to do it through here, you could just use this to create your scripts if you wanted.
Yeah, it's nearly finished there now, isn't it? Just a few more to go. Wow.
That's it.
Well, good. And 16 seconds of joy.
And so now we can hit the migrate data button. Okay, so now it's saying, hey, what are all those things you want to migrate?
Cool.
How many rows are in there? Are we ready to move it? Let's start that migration.
This is, I mean, this is just saving all the time. Like, you wouldn't want to move the data over manually. I mean, people could do a migration by coding a migration, which is just another painful, long process. This tool saves so much time. It's nice to see it execute so quickly. And it's nearly finished now.
I think it's done.
Look at that. That's amazing.
I think it's done. So we could probably come over and have a look at our database.
Yeah, if we look at the properties table, just to see that the data's actually there.
Could we do this?
Verification is really important. So
we do that.
cool. And there's our data. That's amazing.
So that's our data up in our database.
Awesome.
Okay, cool. So so almost done.
Cool. So when we started the session, we said that we've got the website up in the cloud, but it's actually not connected to the database yet. So
let me show you.
yeah, you're going to show me again.
Oh,
Or the application. Yeah, because we had that error message. Yeah, thanks for highlighting that, because it doesn't have the database connectivity. So we've got like this mock layer if it doesn't find the actual database configuration yet. So we've got just one more thing so we can think about how to get the website to talk to the database. And if you're already familiar with ASP.NET, you probably know how to do this. Might want to just quickly type that into the chat window. What do you think it is, Kim?
Oh, I think there's a app settings.json.
Perfect. So, and this is where we're going to define the database connection string. Where's it pointing to right now?
Well, right now it's pointing to our local DB environment. Well, actually, it's using the development.json in here, and you know we can actually set the connection in here if we can set the connection in here if we want to connect to our cloud-based DB, but we wouldn't really want to go and stick in our connection string in here and our username and password in here, because this is going to go into our code. And if this goes into our code and we check it in, it's going to appear out in the public repo. But Azure allows us to override settings directly in the portal, right? So if we go back to our portal, let me back up here and find our portal. So we've got a little option here somewhere to show our connection string. Now, where is that? Is that in the database?
No, that would be in the web service. You might want to go back to all your resources, Kim, and then, well, actually, just go back for a second. I'm going to show you a little trick. Okay. So just go back, hit the browser to where you were on the database server. So this is how I normally do it. If I go, okay, I need to configure something, I'll actually just click on the resource group at the top and then go, and it'll show me just you mouse to the right a little bit. The actual resource group name. If you click on that, it will take you to the resource group, and then you could look at the services only for that resource group.
Sure.
So where's your app service? The third one in that list.
There's one here.
Click on that, yeah, and then we're over to the application. You can start configuring it. My little side note on how I enjoy using resource groups to manage my application.
So we can go to our configuration.
We certainly can.
But don't we have a slight problem here in that we don't know what our connection string is?
Well, we don't. That's a good point. There's two parts to it. So if we go back to our individual database, so we're on the server, but we weren't on the database.
All right. So let's have a look at our SQL database.
Yeah. Cool. And on the left, under the settings, you'll see the connection strings.
Left, connection strings. All right. So Here's a connection string that we might want to use. What do we think? That one?
That's the ADO.net. That's the classic. I feel like we might get it from somewhere else. I'm kind of riffing here, Kim.
Yeah.
Where
that's
would you
all
get
right.
it from?
Well, I would have thought that if we come up here, connect with a second to tell us. No, that's not going to tell us. Connection strings. There we go.
Yeah.
Show our connection strings. Copy that bad boy to the clipboard. Now we can come back to our resource group, right?
Yeah.
You just see what I've got in my. No, that's not it. Come back to a database. I'm just having a look at what it copied in my clipboard, and it wasn't a connection string.
Yeah, I feel like it's a link that you copied. That's a show. It's going back to the same page.
Yeah, I feel it's this one here.
Yeah. So it should have the same configuration details. That's ADO.net. Entity Framework should still use the same details, I think.
Yeah. Let's give it a go.
Okay.
So what we want to do is we want to come back over to our app service.
We'll be less waffly the next time we run this.
Of course, of course. We'll actually know where to click.
Yeah.
Okay. So the question now is, if we go into our configuration, we should
Connection string section, default connection.
Default connection.
Yeah.
We should be able to go and get that value. And
well, we're not quite finished though, even though we've pasted it. You can see the password's blank, or kind of commented it out that we need to supply it.
Yeah. So I've got this little screen.
Okay. What does it say?
It says entering secrets. That's right. Cheeky, huh?
Yeah, that's good.
And so
it's all there now.
Hopefully that's set up there. I better hit the save button.
Good call.
Let's try refresh the database and see what happens. Sorry, refresh the website.
Application JSON, it'll rebuild the application, will it not? That's my understanding. And then we have to wait a little bit longer than we normally would.
Oh my goodness. Look at that.
No warning message. That's amazing.
Okay. And so now
it's exactly what we're after.
We actually have our database connected up to our website that we deployed in the last session. It's all up in the cloud, and no code changes.
Excellent.
Yeah. Alrighty, so let's wrap this up and see what we've done and talk about if we've reached our goals. So the goals, remember, same code base, low maintenance, scalability, security, a low learning curve, because we already know things about SQL. We wanted to migrate our local hosted SQL Server database into Azure Cloud. Have we done that?
Certainly have.
We had a look at a lot of the different Azure relational database offerings, which one would fit our project. We said a single Azure database was the optimal candidate, and that gave us a database technology we already know, we already work with. We saw that we can query it and use it just like a local hosted database. So that goal of we already knew it has been achieved. What do we do then?
Well, we had to configure, or spend some time configuring the compute and storage settings, and looked at the vCore based provision configuration would actually be the optimal choice. I think it was like $5 for our little example. But beyond this, there's actually nothing much else to do. There's no patches, no updates. It's actually pretty much the definition of low maintenance.
Yeah.
Tick, checked. And once the database was created, we just analyzed the different options to migrate our schema and data, and then selected the data migration assistant as the tool to use. And that was a pretty seamless process. We migrated the schema, pushed the data up, verified that the data was in there. It's really good. Oh.
I feel like I'm working for the BBC here. So
you are.
This is my boy Charlie. Are you learning about SQL databases? Yeah. Fantastic.
Can someone say ANSI 92?
So what this all means is we've now got a secure database in the cloud. We can manage it. We can scale it through the portal. Remembering that scalability is one of our goals. The best part is didn't have to make any code changes. and we've got another one in here as well.
Cool.
And,
Yeah, I'll get you on there. If you like. All we had to do was configuration changes, right? And that was the last of the goals.
So that was the last of our goals. So pretty much we've come to the end of another live learn session. So I want to thank everyone for attending, not so much these two, but all the questions in the chat window, your comments. Glenn, thank you very much for being a guest. We're just wrapping up. Thanks very much to you, Glenn, for being my guest. Remember, we're only really at step 2 of 5 on our journey through migrating our web app into the portal. So in our next session, we're going to have a look at automated deployments, which will be really exciting. So we'll see you back then in the next session. Look forward to seeing you then. So for now, take care and see you later.